Good morning, Brazil, and obrigado for inviting me to speak at your conference. And hello from Sweden, or hey, as we say here. So today I'm going to give a talk on plant blindness and sustainability, and I'm going to revolve the talk around a 3-year research project that we did here in Sweden with trainee teachers. So it's embedded in education, but it's very interdisciplinary, as you will hear. So I'm going to start now. Plants are critical to much of life on Earth. They provide necessary oxygen and offer shelter and nourishment on multiple scales in diverse habitats. Humans benefit from the existence of plants, and yet often we remove them from our worldview. This is, of course, not true of all humans, and Chimera has written extensively on particularly indigenous communities and their relationships to plants and how we might learn from those relationships. But as capitalism and climate change increasingly impact the living world, disciplines including art, science and education must work more closely together to consider how an attentive and attuned approach might enable greater collective sensitivity to life as plant, and thus perhaps counter the plant awareness disparity that Parsley has written about that seems to haunt much of contemporary urban life. And this societal challenge is a significant opportunity, I believe, to rewrite the private lives of plants back into the human narrative. Because if we fail to do so, the long view for both plants and humans is looking desolate. I want to make a slightly historical shift back into the 19th century and consider Charles Darwin and his colleague Mary Treat. So Charles Darwin was no stranger to the possibilities that his wife Emma's wardrobe might offer. Not just her wardrobe, actually, her scullery and her body might offer his experiments. So, for example, a whale bone from her corsets helped him to hypothesize the catapult-like pollinia mechanism on an orchid. Clothes pegs assisted in his measurements of the roots, the forces involved in plant root movements. And one of Emma's hairs was placed on the leaves of a carnivorous plant, the one you can see on your screen, Drosera rotundifolia, the common sundew, as part of his research into their sensitivity. Human materials regularly occur in records of Darwin's experiments. And there are records that he wrote, a bit of old nail of my toe was positioned on Drosera rotundifolia. And the responsive leaves of the same plant were exposed to human urine. Unfortunately, we don't know whether it was his own urine or not. Or maybe that's fortunate. With Emma's hair safely stowed upon his person, Darwin travelled from Down House in Kent to London by train. And he did this so the hair could be weighed precisely. And I just want you to take a moment to imagine the weight of one human hair and the plant sensitivity needed to respond. With his carnivorous plant experiments, Darwin combined elements of his own body and Emma's with the leaf surfaces of carnivorous plants. Here then is a science in which plant and human body become entwined. Francis Darwin, one of Charles Darwin's sons, described him as having a most keen feeling for the aliveness of plants, an aliveness which Charles Darwin sometimes tested with the most delicate of human materials, as I showed earlier. But he was not alone in this journey, and he had a correspondent from America, Mary Treat, who lived in Vineland, New Jersey. And Mary Treat was also placing her own fingers in carnivorous plant traps and sometimes staying up all night if needs be to witness the entrapment of insects in underwater traps of the plant utricularia. And by having these sort of experimental lives at home, both Darwin and Treat inhabited domestic environments in which home and science, data and domesticity coalesced around their experiments with murderous plants and their propensities. But I think for me, the most important element of this story is that the ways in which Darwin and Treat focused on these plants was multi-sensory and highly attentive, and it happened over time and in their homes. So the question is for us today, how might modern botanists and botanical educators bring such historical attentiveness to plants in a modern era? And remember, this is an era in which, as the Brazilian botanist Alexandre Antonelli suggests, in asking the question, how much is a flower worth, is complex. Antonelli notes that it really depends on who's answering. And in our excessively monetized societies, as he observes, the economist may attempt more or less objectively to put a price tag on it. But what does this mean for certain plants? Some are valued for their oils, their timber, medicinal compounds, carbohydrate, protein and vitamin values, or their ability to store carbon. In other words, their social utility and economic value. And some plants are removed from the wild for private human spectacle, so for aesthetic pleasure and uniqueness. And this can happen to the extent that their habitat communities are ravaged, and in some cases they become extinct in the wild. So we could say, have we arrived at a time when much of humanity is caught in a utility trap when it comes to appreciating plants and their planetary contributions? And as Kress and Krupnik noted in 2022, are there plant winners and losers in this time of great acceleration? And I think today at this conference, in this discussion, we as botanists and educators must remember that the human impacts on the planet are not evenly distributed across populations. Some cultures are more destructive than others, and not all humans are inattentive to plant life. As many of you are aware, this is especially true in the diverse communities of modern Brazil, as Antonelli has noted in his recent book. In this lecture today, I will draw on research conducted at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden with student teachers. And my key objective is to demonstrate the ways in which interdisciplinary approaches can shape new perspectives on the phenomenon defined as plant blindness by Wandesty and Schuessler from 1998 to 2001, and more recently plant attention disparity as defined by Parsley and her colleagues. And they have built on the work of Wandesty and Schuessler. And particularly in looking at these four components: attention, so not noticing plants; attitude, not liking plants; knowledge, not understanding why plants are important; and relative interest, being less interested in plants than in animals. Many of these things you will have probably experienced as botanists communicating your work to the general public. Indeed, you may have experienced these things at university, both as a student and as a teacher. So if these are the key constituents of PAD, then research needs to examine all four facets in detail. And the research methods that we use must afford deeper opportunities to understand which factors are at play in specific socio-cultural contexts. For the botanical science community to really understand how to counter this phenomenon and the extent to which it exists. And importantly, perhaps we need also to learn how to cultivate plant love in our urban-dominated societies, as McDonough et al. Have suggested in 2019. Before I move on to our study, I would like you to close your eyes and reflect on a plant memory that has impacted on your life. Once you find that memory, consider its aspects. Are you with someone? What is the plant? Are there particular characteristics of the plant that impact on what you think or feel? And do you still, as a plant scientist, have a relationship with that plant? If you are sitting in the conference, please turn to the person next to you and share your memory. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to our research study. The study was called Beyond Plant Blindness, Seeing the Importance of Plants for a Sustainable World, and it was funded by the Swedish Research Council. It was a 3-year study in terms of data collection, but we are still working on the data and creating further publications and discussions. So our research study lasted 3 years, from 2015 to 2017, and involved teacher students studying at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. It also covered a few everyday visitors to the Botanic Garden in Gothenburg and Universium Science Centre. The research team was a transdisciplinary partnership across 3 disciplines: art, science and education, consisting of 6 core researchers, including a doctoral student. 2 further researchers with expertise in psychology and semiotics were brought into the team for specific data gathering and analysis work. The focus of our study was on a teacher-student community, and the total number of teachers who were involved in our teacher students who were involved in our study was 202. And that the biggest group was for the online survey. And B, we looked at 2 presented world environments. These are environments in which the living world is presented to humans as contained collections of rare materials. So environments such as botanic gardens, science centres and museums. And we drew on the work of Braund and Rice for this description and definition. Our study utilises both qualitative and quantitative data from 4 different research methods. We had an online survey containing 30 questions concerning perceptions of and knowledge about plants. And that was important for us because we wanted to look at what knowledge student teachers had about plants, but we also wanted to see what their perceptions of plants were. And we also were interested in what they felt about plants. So that's why we, when we developed the questions, we worked across the disciplines, but particularly with the scientists and the educators. And then when we were coding, we were working with a psychologist as well to look at the levels of interrelationships between knowledge and feelings. And that was the biggest number of teacher students we worked with on the online survey. We also mapped conversations in two environments, the Botanic Garden greenhouse with the rainforest and the rainforest in the Science Centre. And this mapping consisted of observations of where teachers stood in terms of different plants, how long they were there, and we also recorded their conversations. And in this work, the person who did work on semiotics, they were involved in that work too, and have been involved in writing papers. And then we also created, well, the artist members of the team created 3 installations of artworks in which they focused on particular plants in the Botanic Garden that had specific stories around possible extinction, relationship to particular ecologies. And in that, they worked closely with the scientist member of our team. And then finally, the scientist created 3 large posters looking at specific questions about plants that they thought might be interesting for our teacher students. And a very small number of teacher students responded to those. And that was very interesting because the most popular question was, how old can plants be? Basically, how long do they live? And that question really fascinated teacher students. But we also saw that more and more we're in a culture in which the visual is preferred over text. And so it was interesting in terms of how we tell stories about plants to our students, and also how Botanic Gardens might communicate plant science to their visitors. So what was our hypothesis? Well, we had a general hypothesis, which was multimodal and sensoric experiences in these presented world environments, such as Botanic Gardens and science centres, might create shifts in perception away from plant blindness towards seeing the importance of plants for a sustainable world. And then within that, we had 3 main research questions. How might plant-based sensoric experiences influence human perceptions of plants? How might story-based scientific narratives concerning individual plants impact on plant blindness in didactical situations? And by looking through an artistic lens, is it possible to appreciate and identify plants in new ways? So as you can see from our hypothesis and our research questions, we worked very closely to engage with the different disciplines that were involved in the project. The doctoral student did not look at these environments, but went out into a forest near Gothenburg to look at how people related to that kind of environment. So it was complementary to the work in the Botanic Garden and the Science Centre. So what kinds of results did we find? Well, interestingly, our main results from the online survey demonstrate that affective factors play a role in our participants' relationships with plants, memories of times past and plants associated with them. Hence my question to you at the beginning of the talk, asking you about what plants you remember, and if you still have a relationship with those memories as a plant scientist. And then, interestingly, but not surprisingly, seasonality was a really strong factor in the kinds of plants that our students noted as favourite plants, for instance. So things like Vitsipper, the wood anemone, came up a lot because for many of our students, this was the herald of spring. It meant that we were going from the dark winter into the light of spring. And when you live in a country that the dark nights are dark, you do look forward to the sunlight of spring. And then many of our students were drawn to plants for aesthetic reasons, and the beauty of plants does make an impression, but also their symbolic meaning. And we asked the students in the online survey what was their favourite plant and what was their favourite animal, because much of the research that had gone before conflated the two and asked which did students prefer, and we didn't want that head-to-head comparison between plants and animals. We wanted to separate the two out. And interestingly, in our group of results, we found far more diversity in the plants that students named than the animals. And in the animals, there was less diversity, and the focus was very much on companion animals such as dogs and cats and horses, and the occasional elephant. But it was much less diverse. We had a far greater range of species in our favourite plants, which was interesting and different to the work that Wandersley and Schussler had found with, particularly Jim Wandersley's work in the 1980s of student preferences. So that we can say that the work that we've done in Sweden is a counterpoint to the work coming out of Wandersley and Schussler's American context. And that's why it's important to do this work in different cultural and national settings. The artworks, I will just say a little bit about the artworks. So the artworks varied in scale. So the first installation had a series of photographs in which a seed from a scanning electron microscope was foregrounded against a picture of the adult plant, and the adult plant was in black and white, sort of grayscale, and the seed was coloured as naturally as possible to the colours that occurred under the microscope. And then a description of the plant from a curatorial perspective was made as in a scientific footnote. So the human story was very much pushed to the background, and the untold story of the seed was pushed to the foreground. So the privileges that usually happen in representations of plants were absolutely flipped. So that the invisible seed came very much up front and magnified through the SEM, and then the adult plant at the back, and then the human was just this little footnote running along. So there was a series of photographs, and then as the student teachers turned to the right, there was a tank in which these seeds were growing. And what we hoped is that students would begin to make connections between the labelled growing seeds and the photographed seeds. The important thing for us when looking at a question that was common to all three artworks was we wanted it to be open enough to gain the qualitative data, but not so open that it was hard to analyse. So the question we ended up with was, what are your impressions here? And we did get common themes across the three. But the other thing that happened with the three artworks is it very much played on the narrative of different plants, and then it became the individual narrative of one particular plant. So we start with this collection of plants, and then we move to a barn-like building where the awn of a Stipa pinnata, it's a grass, was magnified under the SEM, and then it took 29 different shots, and the artist put them all together and then had this giant awn in the building that people walked into and confronted, and it was super large, and that was quite interesting, because when the student teachers and the everyday visitors then came face to face with this enlarged awn, it seemed to create this intersectional zone between plant and animal identities. And for a moment, the human visitor looking at this giant awn appeared to question, examine, and sort of recalibrate the taxonomies of their impressions. So some participants moved between thinking they were looking at an earthworm or even a one-celled animal to finally deciding it might be part of a plant. But it took them a while to consider that. And we have found that this sort of shifts in scale when you go from the very small to the very large can cause confusion, but also curiosity. And that's something to think about when scientists working with plants want to tell different stories about plants. But there was something that came up that was interesting across the artworks and the online survey. And some of our teacher students and our everyday visitors said that they felt they were encountering the otherness of plants. And in our what is your favourite plant, what is your favourite animal question, the one thing that was absent from the favourite plant answers was any anthropomorphic reasoning. It's not surprising, but it didn't mean that we now have to find, flowers as faces or some other anthropomorphic equivalent, because it seemed that they found enough roots into plantness that that motivated them to be interested in plants. But one of the things we did find is that we need to find the narratives that make public the life as plant story, but without negating the attributes that make plants and their lives other in the eyes of human audiences, because this otherness did seem to draw human curiosity in. And one everyday visitor had been to see a photographic exhibition on horse embryos, and she said that after seeing that, she realised how alike humans and horses were in terms of embryos. And then she realised that was because we were all mammals. But she said when she came to see the seeds, the otherness of plants really confronted her, but it didn't dismiss her curiosity. One of the other issues that we found in the Science Centre rainforest, which made it different from the Botanic Garden rainforest, is that the Science Centre rainforest has birds and monkeys and sloths and cockroaches, and that in those kinds of mixed animal and plant environments, that in order for plants to be noticed, they need to be foregrounded in the design of the spaces and information about them really clearly exposed to human view. And we found that where there wasn't adequate information about the plants just disappeared into this sort of green blur. And if you have highly coloured birds moving and squawking in those environments, the humans are going to obviously be attracted to bright red squawking birds, for example. So we have found that when plants and animals are competing, if you like, for human attention, more needs to be done for the plant stories to come to the foreground. And maybe it is that. Maybe it is the plant story and how we construct those stories that is the critical finding from our work, and that we should engage with memories and sensory moments, if you like, from human lives that maybe we haven't thought about before. We're so into telling the scientific story that maybe we ignore some of the effective doorways into the science. So if I was to summarize the findings from our work, it is this. It is that by using sensory interactions through both artistic and scientific narratives, we do seem to have value in connecting with plants. And this aesthetic attributes, personal memories and emotions in building connections between plants and people. But we do need to do a lot more work when we're thinking about how we foreground plants with when they're in animal-rich presented environments. And a classic example, I don't know if any of you are from Botanic Gardens, but a classic example will be how can we bring human attention to plants in botanic gardens when you might have lizards, for example, or butterflies or frogs moving around in the same area. It seems that we do grasp onto movement. And Wandesy and Schussler, in their early work, said that was one of the biggest challenges. However, we do have things like scanning electron microscopes, so we can bring these more invisible worlds, we can make them large and draw human attention in that way. We can also use colour and photography to draw human attention. So for the final artwork, the artists created these very large perspex, printed perspex windows in a rain shelter, so that the human visitor who went into this rain shelter was looking through the meadow, so the natural environment for the Stipa pinnato, and the other side pinnata, the other side of that meadow was the actual remaining hybrid specimen in the Botanic Garden. But in this flurry of colour and biological diversity, it was very difficult to pick out what was the Stipa pinnata in this picture. And in showing this diversity in this complex, competitive meadow, it took us to the place. It was almost like we were Stipa pinnata trying to compete with all these other species for a taste of life in the meadow. And the irony of all this story is that Stipa pinnata is under threat in Sweden, but in the rest of Europe, it's not so threatened. So it's this idea that individual plants have individual narratives depending on the context. And again, in Brazil, you might have those too. So one of the things we hope is that this work will not only contribute to ongoing debates concerning human attention to plants, but also enrich recent methodological work examining human perception and awareness in relation to botanical attention. And Parsley is continuing to do her work, and she's recently published a paper with Daigle and Sabel, really looking at coding and the sort of methodological questions of plant attention disparity and an inventory, if you like. And we need more of this stuff. But the other question, which Marquez, Ursi, Silva and Caton in 2020 have noted, it's not just the relation between perception and environmental awareness. It's not merely a cognitive question. It includes other socio-historic questions such as economics and politics. So we can't take plants out of those contexts. And as I noted earlier, they are totally wrapped up in a sort of resource-driven capitalistic society. And these contextual factors matter when we consider research into the human-plant interface. And no less so when we read a recently published literature review by Stagg and Dillon. And they have found that human-plant awareness is linked to plant relevance. They found, and I quote from their paper, no concrete evidence for innate plant awareness disparity, but they did find that diminished experience of nature in urbanized societies appeared to be the cause, especially as the studies in their literature review conducted in rural societies had found extensive botanical knowledge when those communities were reliant on biological resources. So we really need to have further research to examine the data emerging from their review in terms of the different socio-contextual settings in which people experience plants. And Brazil is well placed to further this work because you're a large country and you have such diverse communities. And one I think is a really nice small study in the city of Sao Paulo is the Colli Silva one in 2019, when they conducted 49 interviews around an urban green area And what was interesting about that is, and it really feeds back to the data that we found, is that the identity of the trees appeared to matter less to the people interviewed than the calm they were perceived to offer their human spectators. And it didn't matter whether they were native or non-native trees. So it's what the plants offer to us in terms of our emotions that really seems to be a critical link between plants and humans in these urban spaces. And I think more work needs to be done in harnessing those emotions in order to communicate the science. So I've talked about our research methods, I've talked about the transdisciplinarity of our studies, and I've talked about some of the methods and some of the findings. And in the paper that goes with the conference, you'll be able to follow up the references as well. And I would welcome further discussion. But I want to go into a section now where where we can be critical and also ask questions of the future and think about where we might go next. Because humans have always lived in the shadows of plants, but now more than ever there's a planetary imperative to form coalitions of scientists, artists and educators to make plants public and valued in ways beyond modern resource-driven socioeconomics. Because future predictions for the life of trees and their habitats especially are bleak. The recent Botanic Gardens Conservation International State of Trees report in 2021 said that climate change and other human-related actions are ravaging critical species. And the examples they gave are the baobabs in the African savanna, the boreal forests, the giant redwoods in North America, and not least the biodiverse forests of South America. In England, arboreal elders are being removed, particularly ancient oak trees, because they are in the way of a railway, the HS2, that will only shave minutes off a human journey between two large cities. And just imagine their ancient rings of history reduced to wood chip and sawdust. 300-year-old trees. Trees that form biodiverse corridors for bats, for birds, for pollinating insects, just disappearing to make a journey quicker between two cities. It's quite shocking. And maybe that's one of the challenges we have, is to slow down human time to face a more respectful attitude to plant time. And part of our task really is to teach the value of slow time and plant history. So I'd like to ask the conference today some questions. Which trees do you think we will witness in the future? And how will we know them? And what role will they play in education, particularly botanical education? And does it matter that the message that Galbraith wrote about in 2003, Plants Equal Life, in the Curriculum Journal, has become so buried in the modern industrial world? And if we look back on studies like the one I've been involved in, the Beyond Plant Blindness study, can our transdisciplinary research stories weave human and plant back together in a collective dialogue for the future? And what research methods will we use to examine these narratives? And I'd like you to think about your own disciplinary identity and how we can avoid the disciplinary walls that have been built over time and learn to work together as scientists, artists, and educators to face these wicked planetary problems. And I just want to return to one of the questions that we're working on right now. Is actually the first question that we ask on our online questionnaire. And we show a picture of a deer in a forest glade. And we just ask the students, what do you see? And we've coded up all the results, and I think the response was 100%. 202 students did put down what they saw, and we've coded all the responses. But I think for today, one of the elements that is most pertinent to our discussion on botanical education and plant blindness and sustainability is that in our work on what students saw when they looked at the image of the deer in the glade, it's clear that several perceived the animal, the deer, as a subject, whereas many saw the main plant, a grass, as an object to be eaten by the animal. And my question to you is, what might this reduced framing of plants as simply food for animals mean for the ways in which we consider and attend to the importance of plants in educating for a more sustainable world? Because if plants are only seen as food for animals and not seen for doing all the other ecological work they do in the world, where does that leave us? And where does it leave the plants? And critically, in an age of accelerating human impacts and a seemingly accelerating inattention to plants, does it matter? Thank you for inviting me today, and I look forward to discussing these questions.